Hello and welcome to this Conversations on Groong episode. Today, we're talking about the domestic turmoil and political unrest in Georgia, and we'll touch on the protests in Armenia from the perspective of our neighbor in the north. We have with us Dr. Archil Sikharulidze. Welcome to the show, Archil. Great to have you back.
Yeah, thanks for having me again. It's nice to be here.
Gamarjoba.
Gagimarjus.
So for the past 2 months, Georgia has been racked with protests about a so-called bill on foreign agents, which the parliament passed into law last week. And then, of course, it was vetoed by President Zurabishvili. If you follow mainstream media, this law on foreign agents, which the West calls a Russian law or Putin's law, will be catastrophic for Georgia. Interestingly, the US and many other Western states have similar laws to protect them against foreign influence. The US, for example, has FARA, the Foreign Agent Registration Act, which I think dates back to before World War II. The Georgian parliament has the votes to override the president's veto, but given the dire warnings from the EU threatening to end Georgia's EU membership bid and the US threatening sanctions and other actions against Georgia, they have to think through their actions very carefully. What are the key sensitivities around this law, Archil?
Well, once again, thanks for having me, Asbed, because as you said, it's pity for me as a person who grew up in 90s, and I mainly had American and European professors who were talking about freedom of speech, freedom of expression. They would now see that in the mainstream media, unfortunately, there is no more freedom of speech. The same people speak about the same topics for years and years, and others cannot express themselves. So I really appreciate that you invited me. I would like to make a few just comments. You mentioned Salome Zurabishvili and her veto. First of all, when I hear the mainstream media, it seems that these people have no basic knowledge of Georgian politics and politics in general. Because Salome Zurabishvili, she's the president, she's a nominal figure, she has no real power. Her power resides in vetoing issues, and if necessary at some points, letting some prisoners out of the jail, if she decides that these prisoners have already had a punishment. That is her main job. And like a president in Germany, for example, she is more like a public figure who should unite the country. Her first 3 years of presidency were closely attached to Georgian Dream. So the current government that is called pro-Russian. And the opposition used to call her the puppet of Ivanishvili and the Russian government. But at some point after the February 2022, when Russia launched war in Ukraine, and the Georgian government decided not to fully join anti-Russian sanctions because it would have been catastrophic for Georgian economy, she decided to fully the side of EU and the USA. I usually call these people supervisors from USA, EU, because I fully know that absolute majority of American and European parliament members have no clue about Georgia. So usually they're a group of people, 10, 20 people who observe and supervise our country. And Zurabishvili all of a sudden became the biggest anti-government politician in our country. From being the Putin puppet, she turned to a defender of European values, and she's now promoting this platform. So what is the problem with her veto? According to Georgian constitution, president cannot just veto the law. She cannot just come out and say that I don't like this law. She had the chance, and according to law, she should have provided improvements. So her version of the law. And the government told her and called on her to introduce all possible changes, and they were ready to discuss it. But she, if you ask me, violated the constitution and just added 2 comments. So it were not improvements, just comments like on Twitter saying that this law must be cancelled since its introduction. And that's all. She just added 2 sentences. This was, if you ask me, according to the same democratic rules, it is unacceptable. The president of Georgia came out and said that I don't really care about the constitution. I care my values. My values are attached to the European Union. European Union said that we don't like this law, and that's why I just commented the law. And it is disaster because it showed the level of disrespect. Then you mentioned the FARA law. What is the big problem? So what Americans tell us? Our FARA law was introduced during the Nazi Germany, and the goal of this law was to control the influence of Nazi Germany in USA. And that's all. But they do not usually go deeper, do not say that this FARA law is extremely strict and it's still active. plenty of Georgians from opposition are mentioned there as agents of the foreign influence. For example, the mother of Mikhail Saakashvili is registered there as someone who is conducting foreign influence in the United States of America. That's what's interesting. And what are the European position? No arguments, actually. I mean, if you ask our colleagues, what are the basic arguments from the standpoint of law? No arguments, nothing. There's just one statement. Georgia shouldn't accept this law because it does not fit the spirit of European Union. It fits the spirit of Russia. And as a scholar, with all due respect, but I have a right to question who decides what type of spirit this or other laws will have in the future, because this opens a wide opportunity for manipulations. So any other law can be easily called Russian, Chinese, Iranian. It means that the state will not have sovereignty to make any decision because any law can be called pro-Russian. Now about what is your direct, sorry for making this introduction, but sometimes there is no sense of debating if you do not define terms. We need to define some terms initially. So what is happening nowadays? You probably know that 1 year ago, the same law was introduced. I would like to just improve you a bit because the previous one was the law about the foreign agency and the
Back in
foreign agent law.
2023, you mean?
Yeah, 2023. Nowadays, it's called the law about the transparency. So they took even this term, the foreign influence, out of there to make it even more to use terms more acceptable for Georgians. Yeah. So this was canceled. And you know that by that time, the protest took place, but at some moment, usually in the evening, the protest took a pretty violent phase. They attacked the building of parliament. They tried to seizure the building of parliament. And at this point, I think, plus, because government negotiated with the EU some terms, the government decided to retreat. But even 1 year ago, I told my colleagues that this law, whether by Georgian Dream, and I make this prediction, or any other government will be introduced by any means, because this is the global tendency in Germany, in France, in USA, in Australia, everywhere, because we all understand that the foreign influence became so strong that there is need to control the money flow. Nowadays, this protest didn't manage to push the government. As far as I understand, government was well prepared. Plus, government members stated that they negotiated with the European colleagues, the American colleagues, that they asked the European American colleagues to bring more transparency. And then they promised, but by the end of the day, as they argue, and to be fair with you, I have no doubt that they could have been said this and told by our colleagues. American European representatives said that if EU and the USA gives something to Georgia, Georgia has no right to debate or to question, because the interest of the European Union and the interest of the United States of America will always, by default, fit interests of Georgian people. And that's very interesting.
Yeah, that's absolutely disrespectful of Georgia's sovereignty, intelligence, and everything else. I mean, just looking at the law itself, for me, when I was reading it, it said that if an organization gets more than 20% of its money from outside sources, external sources, then they need to be registered as organizations that are, quote, pursuing the interests of a foreign power, unquote. I thought that was a little too aggressive. And frankly, I thought that there's probably room to argue the language of the bill and come up with some kind of a compromise somewhere where everybody could agree. But you are saying that there was absolutely no room to argue. They said you just should not have this law, period. That's it.
The funny thing is that you mentioned US, but the fact of the matter is that many EU countries, Germany included, have such laws, and EU itself is developing such a law. But whenever you talk to even like people from the EU on Twitter, I try to initiate this discussion, and they have no arguments other than this will hurt the NGO industry in Georgia, and therefore it is bad, and therefore it is by default pro-Russian, even to the point when you say, well, what about the EU? Why is it bringing such a law? And they say, well, the EU law is much more liberal than the US law. So to the point of Asbed, okay, well, what if we try to bring the two laws closer to each other? Let's
Yeah,
see what
soften
the
the
EU law
language if
is,
necessary.
soften the language if necessary. But I don't doubt that this is basically a very politically motivated. Yes, it will rein in the NGO industry, but my personal belief, and maybe I should not be so expressive about it, but my personal belief is both in Armenia, at least, I know Armenia, so I'll say that the NGO industry in Armenia needs to be reined in. It is acting against the interests of the government of Armenia and the people of Armenia. And by reined in, we just need more transparency. We need to know when a popular NGO, one of the big fishes in Armenia in terms of NGO, when they're making videos about anti-Iranian videos, and it's not like, hey, Iran is illiberal, Iran is. They're basically saying that Iran is working against Armenia. So they're clearly putting away all their masks about, hey, we're here to promote human rights. They're basically trying to say and trying to propagandize that Iran is working against Armenia, and Armenia should not establish close relations to Iran. That's an obvious red flag that the interests of this NGO may not necessarily lie with the interests of Armenia. And I'm not saying that Armenia needs to fully join Iran, but I think most geopolitical analysts would agree that in Armenia, you have to establish very close relations with as many neighbors as you can, including Iran. So someone arguing against that is clearly questionable in terms of their political opinion. And we need more transparency of how and why they're expressing those ideas.
You know what, Hovik? I think I will make a point that is relevant to all post-Soviet countries. What is the problem? The true problem is that when we speak about NGOs, then we usually by default move on to such concept as a civil society. And here's the serious problem in Georgia, and I think that the same was in all post-Soviet countries. What is the problem here? We don't have civil society in its classical understanding. So what is civil society in US or in Germany? This is a group of people, usually citizens of their own country, who are financed by their own fellow mates to follow or to implement various social projects or political projects. But in our countries, and that's the problem, because of the so-called Soviet Union, we had no civil society. We had no money to invest to civil society. Our Western colleagues came and they decided that, okay, how can we promote democracy in Armenia and Georgia? Yes, we will help to establish civil society. So they injected lots of money. And at some point, they thought that we will later on transfer this civil society to citizens of Georgia or Armenia. But because Georgians are still comparatively poor, they don't have enough resources to support the civil society. By the end of the day, in 2024, we have a proprietary civil society. So we have a bunch of people who are extremely rich, well-prepared, well-educated, who mainly sit in Tbilisi or Batumi, and who are totally, fully, financially and logistically dependent on American European money. So we have some kind of operational system called Windows. So it's a proprietary system that is controlled and determined by one company who tells you what are your main goals, what are your determinants, and you either follow it or you just don't use Windows. And that is the problem, because when people come to me and say that Georgian civil society says, I say, wait a minute, because if you check the statistics by the same CRRC Georgia, which is a part of the civil society, the highest level of trust to Georgian NGO sector civil society that ever was fixed was 29%. So not even 1/3 of Georgian population trusts Georgian civil society. And the problem is because there is a strong feeling that civil society of Georgia is a proprietary. It belongs not to Georgian citizens, but it belongs to those who pay money. And this is pretty pragmatic. And plus one more thing that I've been teaching at Tbilisi State University for years, there's the concept of the open door. That means that this continuous transfer of politicians and businessmen from their own fields to the civil society, by the end of the day, highly politicized it. So, as my colleague well said, every political party has its own civil society that is financed by foreign actors. So there's a whole chain. On the one hand, foreign actors who are financing civil society, But these civil societies are attached to political parties, and we have a situation when, and I'm not speaking about only about the West. This is the problem. People speak about only about the West. It's not only about the West. We know that millions of dollars come from Turkey, Azerbaijan, Iran, China, Arabic countries, and we have the proof of that. Yeah. So we have some kind of black market of money that comes from different countries, not only from the West, and that resides in the what we call civil society. And these people use democracy promotion as a tool to say that we are untouchable. You cannot check me because I am representative of civil society. And this is a serious problem because as we all understand, I mean, Georgian civil society, Armenian civil society either belong to its own people or it doesn't belong to its people. Then it means that it is not Georgian civil society. It's a proprietary civil society, either Georgian or it's proprietary, controlled from outside.
Archil, so what is expected from this law? What does the Georgian government expect to achieve with a law on transparency?
I think it's a pretty obvious. I mean, in this sense, I don't think that the Georgian Dream is so sophisticated in politics that they can make some, 10 moves in advance. I think this is very naive. I think that in Georgia, it's going through the same mistake that we had during Saakashvili government, when we blamed everything on one person, saying that the source of the problem was Saakashvili. Now, the same is people saying about Bidzina Ivanishvili, as he was some like, I don't know, Cardinal de Richelieu controlling everything, which is, I think, pretty naive, but this is the tendency in general, to blame one person for everything. Irakli Kopahidze said straightforward, our goal is to finally get documental proof that the money from foreign countries, and not only from the West, but at the end of the day, are not spent only on social and educational projects, that they are also spent on political activities. And these political activities mean not some debates, but political protests, financing those people who were arrested during riots. What is according to every law on earth is a violation of sovereignty. And obviously, they know that parliamentary elections are coming in October. I think I am saying this for the last 3 years, the Georgian Dream will supposedly win because political opposition, like in Armenia, is in a deep crisis. They have nothing to offer for general wider Georgian society, except shouting that we will defeat pro-Putin regime, and next day we will join Ukraine in its fight against Russia, and we will all go to heaven under the umbrella of EU, and this all fairy tales. There is nothing else to offer. And Georgian Dream remembers the last experience. I will remind you that after the last parliamentary elections, which were recognized by all international institutions, parliamentary opposition, as well as some NGOs, INGOs, refused to recognize elections. So they started protests. And Georgian Dream would like to have some documents that they can use after the parliamentary elections to say that, you know what, these people who say that we're independent, we represent people, they are dependent. This is the money, A, B, C, D. And the microphone was bought by this money. The people who were detained during the riots, they were paid by foreign money to be liberated, not by Georgian people. And this one more very interesting issue. I do consider this law not as a rivalry between EU and Russia, but as a rivalry for the right to choose who will speak on behalf of Georgian people. On the one hand, there is NGO, as I said, and this is very strong, very accumulated, and very, very united small group of people. And these people actually challenged Georgian Dream. They even came out and said that we do represent people, you do not represent people. And on the other hand, it's not only Georgian Dream, but it's general any government who says that we are actually representative of the people because we've been elected and you have not been elected. But these people say that, yes, we have not been elected, but EU and US supports us. And because EU and US are unchallenged, everything they say is by default good for Georgian people. It means that we do represent people more than you do represent. It's very interesting debate and fight for the hearts and minds of Georgian people.
We were talking with Sopa Japaridze about a week ago, and she highlighted how much the West likes to rely on democracy indicator rankings that some of these NGOs generate. And often the Georgian government does not believe that these rankings reflect reality. Yet because the NGOs are paid by the West and the West consumes their rankings, Georgia suddenly becomes a hostage to the influence that all this funding is generating.
I mean, if I needed to write a scholarly paper, not like an expert paper or civil society paper, I could have proved this easily. I can bring just one example. Civil society organizations who are almost in opposition to the government, they've been writing papers for the last 2, 3 years that Mikhail Saakashvili is a political prisoner, that all of his cases are fabricated, and they even managed to persuade US Department to sanction those judges who were in charge of his cases, of Mikhail Saakashvili's cases. Yesterday, European Court on Human Rights in Strasbourg said, I quote, there are no reasons to doubt decisions made by this judge that Mikhail Saakashvili is not a political prisoner, that he is not going to die, and allegations against him were totally proved. The end of the quote. So, on the one hand, as Sopo said, on the one hand, we have NGOs, and some members of these NGOs are the former politicians from Mikhail Saakashvili's government, who used to write that Saakashvili is a political prisoner for years, and we even witnessed actually the European Parliament getting some documents calling on Georgian government to release Saakashvili as a political prisoner. And on the other hand, we have judgment by the highest possible democratic European institutions and human rights that say that these claims are false. So I have a question now. Should I rely on Georgian NGOs on decision of Strasbourg? I think that as someone, if you really share the European values, if you really share the superiority of law, we should follow the law. And the law and judgment was made clear yesterday. And I think that's what Sopo writes is a really serious problem. Because when we speak about the indexes and all these charts, people think that, I don't know, like Venice committee sent the independent researchers here. No, they heavily, totally rely on those NGOs who are on the ground. So they pay these NGOs to make research. And these NGOs are usually full of people who oppose the government. They write stuff that sometimes does not even correlate with the objective reality, opposes decisions by European Court on Human Rights. And then we sometimes see the reports from US Department that contradicts objective reality. For example, one more like example. I read a report that Mikhail Saakashvili is in jail for the last 3 years, but he hasn't been in jail for the last 1.5 years. He resides in a 5-star hospital with no restrictions almost. The only thing he cannot do, he cannot just live with, So, I mean, this is even factually lie. He is not in the jail, no? And that is a bit astonishing. How, on the one hand, you have facts. On the other hand, some really serious politicians tell you things that are irrelevant because they do not represent factuality on the ground.
You are listening to the Groong podcast. Hovik, let us make a quick break to thank our listeners for their support and also remind them that we truly appreciate our many supporters who have signed up as sustaining members.
Yes, indeed. I would like to join Asbed in thanking all of those who have signed up to support us, especially through Patreon and recurring methods. All the support is appreciated. And, you can already see the effects of that in the fact that we are now improving our presence online on social media. For instance, we recently got the blue check on Twitter. It really helps in terms of the number of people who see our posts, the number of, we've gotten a bunch of new followers. So please continue doing this. We really need all the help you can. And it's not only money, which we sorely need, I think, in order to improve our reach, but it's a vote of confidence for us that we're doing the right thing. So consider donating to us. The URL is podcasts.groong.org, and then you can click on the donate link to see the donation options.
Yeah, and folks, this request to support us is for a couple of reasons. We want to see that you value the shows that Hovik and I are putting a lot of effort and time into. We think our shows are reaching an important segment of Armenians, both in the Republic as well as in the diaspora, and also diplomats who do not have easy or in-depth access to what is going on with Armenians and in the Republic or abroad. And that brings me to the second point, Hovik, that you were saying. We want to extend our reach to a greater audience and to more of our communities everywhere. That is where we plan to allocate whatever sustaining funds that we are getting. And sustaining membership actually helps us understand the flow of money a little bit better so that we can allocate the resources on an ongoing basis. podcasts.groong.org/donate.
Thank you, folks. And now let's go back to our discussion with Archil Sikharulidze about Georgian and Armenian protests and any comparisons we can make between the two. Archil, we talked a little bit about this last time. Georgian society is heavily polarized. And when you look at the political narratives, if you're pro-government, then you're pro-Russian. Meanwhile, the protesters are viewed as pro-Western, and there is no middle ground. But to understand what's going on, we first need to understand how to characterize the Georgian government truly, and it's very difficult, as you say, because of all these negative reports that outsiders look at when they consider Georgia. But, let me just ask you, you characterize the Georgian Dream Party, or most of the people who are part of the party, the leadership of the party, what is so pro-Russian about them?
First of all, let me say that the Bidzina Ivanishvili was very close ally of Mikhail Saakashvili. Plenty of his greatest achievements were able due to his financial support. I mean, it's obvious. Before he entered into political life in 2011, he was considered as a godfather of Mikhail Saakashvili, of his movement. And he was not pro-Russian by then. As soon as he entered the politics, he became pro-Russian immediately. And I will remind you that the 90% of those politicians who are not in position were also called pro-Russians. So
when you say he became pro-Russian, I think it's important to clarify. Did he suddenly have a change in political position, or is a public perception about him?
No, it was in Georgia, being pro-Russian has nothing to do with really being pro-Russian, with having some KGB context. It's not about, I mean, that is the problem. When people say that someone is pro-Russian, they speak about the spirit, the godlights, and I mean, it has nothing to do with your foreign dimension, with your context to Russia. It is only the part of political rivalry. So, just one example. Georgi Gaharia, the former prime minister of Georgia under the Bidzina Ivanishvili governments, who was by the same opposition called the puppet of Bidzina Ivanishvili, now is in charge of the political rivalry again. Bidzina Ivanishvili, he is not a puppet of Russia anymore. Now he is the biggest friend of the West. So this is the normal standard issue. For people like me, scholars, I do not even seriously consider, because all the time people speak about being pro-Russian, it reminds me, the famous words during the Nazi Germany, who is Jewish here, who is not, is decided by the party. Not by the facts. It's not about the facts. It's about who is now relevant, who can be used as a tool, and who cannot be. And I will bring one example. I mean, I spoke with American high official, and I've been asked actually, do you consider Georgian Dream as a pro-Russian? I think that, and if you track down messages from the West before the war, I emphasize before the war, all American and European senior officials used to say that Georgian Dream is not pro-Russian. It's pragmatic. It's following the policy of balancing. And it was actually highly cherished. And one of the last statements were made by Austrian Prime Minister, who was asked before the war, do you consider Georgian Dream to be pro-Russian? And Austrian Prime Minister said that Georgian Dream is a smart political power who realizes where Georgia is located, as you said, Hovik, and that Georgia needs partnership with local powers. It needs to balance Russia. Because Georgia cannot challenge Russia, and there is clear understanding that the West will not be able to help Georgia to counter Russia if something happens. But this narrative immediately changed after the war, because you probably understand that both in the US and the EU, the narrative dramatically changed. Now we should be all combined against Russia. And when Georgian Dream came out to say, well, I had this pragmatic policy. This is my platform. This is how I win elections. And I'm not going to change it. I'm not going to introduce it to all protests because this will damage economics. All of a sudden, Georgian Dream became pro-Russian. And one more thing that I would like to bring is there's a former professor from Columbia University, Lincoln Mitchell, maybe you heard of him. He was advisor to Zurabishvili. Previously, he wrote a really nice book about Georgia and certain democracy. He knows Georgia really well. He was asked in 2013 whether he considers Georgian Dream to be a pro-Russian. And he said, really nice thing. He said, do you believe the Georgian elections are more or less competitive and the governments elected are legitimate? Yes. Do you believe the Georgian people are vastly pro-Western? Yes. So how do on earth vastly pro-Western people every year elect pro-Russian government? This is unimaginable. It's non-logical. And that is the problem. Now this argument some Georgian liberals are trying to challenge this, saying that because there are no alternatives. But no, it is because in wider Georgian perception, Georgian Dream is more like a pragmatic power rather than pro-Russian or radically pro-Western.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And well, obviously we have some of it here in Armenia as well, right? We have the Pashinyan government who is now unabashedly pro-Western. And there's this effort. So when this Archbishop Bagrat led his protest movement to Armenia, there was this explicit propaganda against him, alleging him to be pro-Russian. So this guy who is educated in the UK and Canada, who has dual citizenship in Canada, who speaks very bad Russian, is being labeled as pro-Russian by the media, and also partly by the media that is supported by the West. It's just, the bastardization of the concept of democracy and free speech and how information, sometimes under the sponsorship of Western sources, becomes like worse propaganda than communist Pravda days. And it's very difficult to figure out how to properly assess the truth. The only other remaining question that I had on this topic is, so do you believe that this pro-Russian versus anti-Russian, this propaganda war is purely in the context of the upcoming elections? And also, Sopo Japaridze said something to me as well last time, which was that even this foreign agent law could have been introduced by the Georgian Dream in order to curtail the influence of the NGOs ahead of the elections. So, how big of an impact on this whole sort of media war is the upcoming elections? How big of an impact is that having?
Well, I think that with regard to Sopo's statement, I agree in the sense that it's all about, initial attempt to have some kind of protest blitzkrieg, to aggressively attack the government by saying that we are peaceful, but in the evenings we are not peaceful at some moments. And this is also interesting how Western media presents it, that it's peaceful, and then you at some point see the same people breaking the doors and burning down some stuff. I don't understand how can you call this peaceful, but this is how it represented, And obviously, we all now understand that elections are the only way out. Protests, they are massive comparatively, yes. But the government was very obvious, saying that we have enough power, enough control over institutions to handle you. We can deal with you easily. We can use all the tools we inherited from Saakashvili government to actually restrict your freedoms. And I think that there is obvious understanding that, well, A, no revolutions. There is no green light from the wider Georgian society. It's generally unacceptable for the last 2 decades. B, these people have no tools, no real power to make some kind of Euromaidan. And C, that even if they could, elections will be still the only way out. And Georgian Dream, and I'm really glad that at last European American and political position recognized, still holds significant electorate support. So even if you manage to overthrow the government, during the election, they will still get the majority of voters by the end of the day. So you cannot just overthrow the Georgian Dream, hoping that it will disappear. It will not.
That's interesting. So if elections are the only way out, do you think that these moves by the US, for instance, to restrict visa travel of Georgian Dream, and in fact, maybe even worse things like from the EU, for instance, if the EU threatens to stop the membership process, do you think those things will have an effect in the elections and help the opposition? And maybe that's how they can sort of interfere externally in the elections?
Yeah. First of all, I think that I don't think that, I think these are mainly threats because I think they will wait till the elections and the reports coming from European American colleagues, and because I think this nonsense try to officially sanction people before elections because if they win, and I don't think that Europeans and Americans are so stupid not to consider such a possible outcome, then you will have your only strategic ally, the most strategic ally with the government legitimate by sanction. It will be nonsense. So I think that the statement by Blinken and this is like swaggering, playing with the muscles, saying that we have opportunity to punish you. But and here's the second part of your question. As I said, Georgia also has a deep state. So I usually differentiate like political boumond, like elites in Tbilisi, in city center, in Batumi, and the rest of the Georgia. So when we speak about the influence on the voters, we mainly speak about 20-25% of Georgians who can be really, who really cares what Americans said, what Europeans said. But the rest of the voters, 75%, they have nothing to do with all Europeans grants, scholarships. And for them, I mean, you can sanction me, but I have no money to travel to USA. I mean, what is the point of sanctioning me? My well-being is not dependent on American money, European money. I trade with Turkey, with Iran, with China, with Russia. I mean, and that's what people don't understand. So during elections, we will have on the one hand the NGO and the political opposition. On the other hand, we will have a deep state. And I think that Georgian Dream has really strong ground there because what Georgian Dream says, its platform is very strong because Georgian Dream comes out and says, look at me, look, I am the only government who managed to keep peace in Georgia while there's a war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. There's crisis in Turkey, crisis in Iran, crisis in Ukraine and Russia. And this is the only place where we have no war. And they say that something very important for the middle class in Georgia, that this is the only government who managed to keep balance, keep peace and non-violence for the last decade, at least, because there were no other governments who managed to do this. And opposite to Georgian Dream, there is nothing to offer. I mean, if you ask what Georgian civil society, what American embassy offers me in exchange of refusal of the law, nothing. Something irrelevant for the deep state.
Archil, before we finish for today, let's turn our attention a little bit to Armenia. As Hovik mentioned a little bit earlier, for the past couple of months, Archbishop Bagrat Galstanian has been leading intense anti-government protests to stop Pashinyan from continuing unilateral concessions of land, of territory to Azerbaijan. Have you been following this Tavush movement protests in Armenia, and how do you view this overall struggle between government and opposition?
Of course, I'm observing. I have lots of friends, and some of them are on the side of of the government. Others are on the side of protesters. It somehow reminds me Georgian case. On the one hand, we have, as far as I understand, Nikol Pashinyan, who considers it important to solve all problems with Azerbaijan as the way out from this dilemma. And so for him, it seemed that if he manages to deal with Azerbaijan, there will be no need for Russia, no need for some tensions with Turkey and Baku. And as some argue that he's pro-Westerner, something that must be also tested because being pro-Westerner and being Westerner are two different issues, So in general, so I think that his policy is very really reminds me of Saakashvili. What was his initial idea? Okay, the limitation with Azerbaijan, with Armenia, with Russia, with Turkey, some concessions like we have like David Gareji, a monastery complex dilemma there, and give everything to Russia to distance from Russia as soon as possible. And as a result of this, we had the protests against Saakashvili that failed because the Western countries step in and said that, you know what, if you want to challenge Saakashvili, win elections. But because there was a crisis in Georgian society, Saakashvili managed to stay in power. So it seems like the same is happening in Armenia. So I'm not sure whether Pashinyan will manage to do this or not, because I'm observing also a situation in Azerbaijan, in Baku. And well, you probably know that some statements by Aliyev are not pretty friendly. So I'm not sure that all these concessions will be enough for Baku. And I have a very simple question. If it won't be enough, what else can Pashinyan offer? And this is really interesting. What if Baku decided these 4 villages are not enough? We need 5th village, 6th village. We need A, B, C, D.
And we are quite concerned that this is only the start, actually, because there have been other territories that have been mentioned. A couple of 100 square kilometers are already occupied, and there's no talk about returning those. And in addition, whatever maps they are currently using, supposedly the return territory of 6 or 7 square kilometers was part of Azerbaijan before 1990, 1991, but there were also territories that Azerbaijan took over. And when I said unilateral concessions, I really meant that the territories are being given to Azerbaijan, but none of the Armenian territories are being returned to Armenia. So it's a one-sided affair.
So I mean that was my point, and that's why it reminds me. I mean, I cannot avoid making parallels with Saakashvili, because initially the first reaction in Georgia was that this is another Saakashvili. Maybe as not popular, as not strong as Saakashvili was, maybe is not well paid and supported, because Saakashvili was supported by Russia, by US. It was not just unilateral stuff, yeah. But now the idea is the same. I mean, after Saakashvili failed to negotiate terms with Russia, his policy was very obvious: give up everything, give up all independence, give up everything just to distance. But by the end of the day, I would remind you and all your audience, the first person who set visa-free travel to Russians, who met Russians on the border saying that Russian money doesn't smell, was Saakashvili. What I mean here is that I understand Pashinyan's ideas. I know that he's surrounded by some people who have the same thoughts and they take inspiration from Georgia, but sometimes they forget the rest of the Georgian history, you know? This part of the Georgian history, when after the war in 2008, Georgia has been left alone against Russia, and the Georgian government, who was pretty anti-Russian, came to a conclusion that they have no other choice rather than to trade, to discuss problems with Russia. And I think that this attempt to run from Russia, and plus take into consideration the geopolitical disposition, because by the end of the day, we have no issues with Turkey. We have no issues with Baku, and Armenia is somehow surrounded by non-friendly countries. The only real country that have no issues with Armenia is Georgia, but Georgia itself is in crisis. So I'm not sure from geopolitical understanding how Pashinyan is going to respond to other challenges. Okay, 4 villages, then 5, 6, 7, 8. At some point, he will be forced to stop.
We have, of course, a slightly different history with the genocide, that we do have issues with Turkey and also Baku from that perspective. And we don't have real issues with Iran or Georgia. But Hovik, correct me if I'm wrong. A lot of the current government's ruling party came from NGO backgrounds before they were in the government. Is that correct? Western-funded NGOs, as a matter of fact.
A significant contingent of the support base and his lieutenants are from the pro-Western background, and I mean from the NGO background, including Armen Grigoryan, head of the National Security Council, Arat Mirzoyan, the foreign minister. So yes, and I believe that those group of people, rather than potentially the ones who may have had more of an independent streak in their politics, those people are now ruling the country and advising Pashinyan on what to do. One of the interesting questions is whether all of this was predetermined in 2018 when the Pashinyan regime accomplished the Velvet coup, and I'll use that word because that's what I believe what happened. Whether that was all predetermined when they came to power and all these people were in place, or there's this theory that sometime in 2022, when the Russian forces in Ukraine started pulling back, the Pashinyan team made a decisive move to essentially abandon Russia, go to Brussels to negotiate with Aliyev and essentially agree to concede Artsakh and give up Artsakh. That, I think it's debatable, but Archil, in terms of parallels between Georgia and Armenia, do you believe that when Saakashvili came to power, the future course of Georgia was already set in motion, or did things happen along the way that influenced his decision still?
You know what? As a scholar, I know all these positions. Some say that he was initially by pro-Russian, so he was sent by Putin, who said that, okay, initiate war there, and we'll recognize independent states. I know people who said that he was a puppet of the US and George W. Bush. But if you ask me, I think the situation was much more complicated because maybe you remember, but during the process, it were not usually actually European American ambassadors who were there. There was a Igor Ivanov, the former foreign minister of Russia. So I think that from my perspective as a scholar, this was a mutual demand and support from the East-West, who tired from Eduard Shevardnadze, who wanted someone young who could have been the subject of new debate, new agreements. And as far as you probably also remember, his first international visit was to Moscow. And there are rumors and whispers what he debated there, but by the end of the meeting, Putin and Saakashvili came out and they said that they came to a common agreement that they will, I will quote, build Georgia based on mutual understanding. But at some point, and no one has a real answer to this perception of mutual understanding collapsed. I call it the end of the honeymoon between Moscow and Tbilisi. It was between the August 2004 when the conflict erupted in Skhinvali. And this point, it became obvious. So Saakashvili was elected in 2004 in January. And then there was a honeymoon with Moscow. In August, there's a conflict in Skhinvali, and the prominent words by Putin that this is untrustworthy person, that we cannot come to some agreement that he will follow. And from this point, I think this was the point when, on the one hand, Putin realized that these people didn't want actually to have Russia somewhere close,
Right.
and Saakashvili and his colleagues, even though they hiddenly cooperated with the Russians, they sold strategic institutions and buildings, and they made business with the Russians. It's not a secret. They had this anti-Russian rhetoric, and they really thought that they can cancel Russia. Just because George W. Bush supported Georgia, and there were well known like words by George W. Bush saying that I draw a red line on Caucasian mountain, and I really remember this, and I don't think this was predetermined. I think that Saakashvili was disillusioned. He thought that Russia was very weak. He thought that Russia was a Yeltsin period government, had a Yeltsin period government, and he was persuaded by his colleagues in the US, as Posner likes to say, Vladimir Posner, that Russia lost the civil war, so they don't do anything, And we actually have this rhetoric. I'm not sure whether it's happening in Armenia. Unfortunately, my Armenian is not so good yet. But in Georgia, you could have turned the TV and hear really serious guys saying that Russia has no army. They have junk tanks, no weapon, and the Georgian army will defeat a Russian army in a few days. So this was a serious rhetoric, and I think that there are basic misunderstanding, misconceptions, and making parallels. Well, I always say I tell my colleagues in Armenia, so you can take the lessons from Georgia. It's unnecessary to repeat the same mistakes. I don't think that Russia will let actually Armenia to live in a way that Pashinyan may want to. If Russia decided to invade Ukraine, to kill hundreds, thousands of people from both sides, what will Russia do if Armenia decides to become as they like to say, the pillar of democracy promotion in the post-Soviet space.
That's it, yes.
I think one of my colleagues, I will not use his name, said that in 1 year, Russia will have dominant power, will have enough military, and will come back to you. So I think that once again, it will be really wise to take the experience from Georgia and do not repeat the same mistakes. And we obviously made some significant mistakes, and we suffered lots of damage and death and disadvantages.
Agree. All right, well, this was a very interesting discussion, Archil. I think that we do have a lot in common, and we have to learn from each other's histories. So we will continue these discussions regularly, I hope. But today we leave it here. Thank you, Archil, again for joining us.
Thanks for having me, and I hope that this insanity will stop at some point, and we can finally use what Clausewitz was calling diplomacy, using other tools rather than just military rhetoric and swaggering.
Yes.
Thank you, Archil, for your time.
Thank you.
Okay, that's our show today. The episode was recorded on May 25, 2024. We've been talking with Dr. Archil Sikharulidze, who is the founder of the Tbilisi-based research institute Sikha Foundation in the Republic of Georgia. He holds degrees in international relations and focuses on Russian and Islamic studies, as well as political processes and international relations in Ukraine, the South Caucasus, and Kazakhstan, and writes extensively for various local and international platforms. Please remember to support us. Go to our donate page, podcasts.groong.org/donate. Become a sustaining member of Groong and give monthly. Thank you in advance. I'm Asbed Bedrossian.
And this is Hovik Manucharyan.
Please follow us on social media and follow us everywhere you get your Armenian news. The links are in the show notes. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you soon.